Here is what you need to know. African organizations face an average of 3,153 cyber attacks per week. That is 60% higher than the global average, according to Checkpoint's African Perspectives on Cybersecurity Report 2025. Not slightly higher, 60% higher. On a continent where the tools, the talent, and the institutional capacity to respond are significantly less developed than in most of the regions those attackers are also hitting. The economic cost is not a rounding error either. The United Nations Economic Commission for Africa has put the figure at roughly 10% of GDP lost annually to cybercrime across the continent. 10%. At a time when most African economies are working hard to grow at 4 or 5% a year, a 10% cybercrime drain is not a background risk. It is an active drag on development. And the talent gap that sits underneath all of this is in some ways the most structurally serious. The World Economic Forum's Global Cybersecurity Outlook 2026 found that at least 63% of organizations in sub-Saharan Africa lack adequate cybersecurity professionals, not a modest shortfall. Nearly 2/3 of organizations. The digital infrastructure is being built, the threats are accelerating, and the workforce needed to stand between the two simply does not exist yet at the scale required. The attack surface is expanding faster than the defenses. The reason Africa faces a disproportionate threat is not that attackers specifically target Africa for ideological reasons. It is that Africa's rapid digital adoption is creating an expanding attack surface in environments where the defensive layer has not kept pace. When a government deploys a national digital ID system across millions of citizens, it is also creating a single database that, if compromised, gives an attacker access to the identity records of an entire population. When a country connects its e-government portals, its customs systems, and its tax databases through a shared digital infrastructure, it is also connecting the potential blast radius of a single breach across all of those systems simultaneously. This is not hypothetical. In 2024, Malawi's Department of Immigration and Citizenship Services suffered a cyber attack that compromised its e-passport issuance system. The attackers demanded a ransom. Passport services were suspended for at least 2 weeks. The personal data of citizens who had applied for passports was at risk of being sold on dark web forums. A government service that millions of citizens depend on rendered inoperable because the security layer of a system that was being actively digitized had not been hardened sufficiently before it went live. In Kenya, the Micro and Small Enterprise Authority, which supports millions of SMEs, was hit by a significant cyber attack in early 2025. Investigations pointed to outdated software and weak access controls. Business registration details, financial records, and internal communications were exfiltrated and reportedly listed for sale online. The organizations at the center of Kenya's SME economy suddenly exposed. The governance deficit is the real problem. Here is the part of this story that tends to get lost in the technical coverage. The cybersecurity gap in Africa is not primarily a technology problem. Most of the tools, frameworks, and standards that would significantly reduce Africa's exposure exist already. What is missing is the governance architecture that enforces their use. The African Union's Malabo Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection has been open for ratification since 2014. As of 2026, only a small number of AU member states have ratified it. That is 12 years of a continental cybersecurity framework sitting available and largely unused, while the attack surface it was designed to govern has grown dramatically. At the national level, many African countries have enacted cybersecurity laws. But as the Circle ID analysis published in May 2026 puts it directly, enforcement has been lacking. Governments have established the laws without equipping regulators with the authority, resources, and technical expertise to enforce compliance effectively. A cybersecurity law that is not enforced is not a cybersecurity posture. It is a document. The Telecom Review Africa's June 2026 analysis of the African cybersecurity market confirms the direction. The market is growing at a projected compound annual growth rate of 13.3% between 2026 and 2031. Investment is real and it is increasing. But the same analysis notes that African countries lose an average of 10% in annual GDP to cyber-related crime, and that the gap between international standards like ISO 27001 and NIST and Africa's unique operational context is actively working against effective adoption of those standards. The talent gap is structural, not cyclical. The skills gap deserves its own moment because it is the least likely to be solved quickly, regardless of how much policy attention it receives. Cybersecurity is one of the fastest evolving technical disciplines in the world. The tools that defenders need to understand are changing constantly. The threat actors they are defending against are increasingly well-resourced, increasingly AI-assisted, and increasingly targeting the specific vulnerabilities of mobile-first, cloud-dependent environments, which is precisely what most of Africa's digital infrastructure looks like. Training a cybersecurity professional to a level where they can meaningfully operate in that environment takes years. The academic pipeline in most African countries is simply not producing them at the rate the threat environment requires. According to Checkpoint's 2025 research, by 2026, most African firms are expected to consume security as a service, using managed security service providers to access AI-assisted defense and bridge the talent gap. That is a practical response to a real constraint. It is not a solution to the underlying workforce deficit, and it introduces its own dependencies and supply chain risks. The strategic insight. Here is the reframe I want every policymaker, regulator and ICT minister watching this to hold on to. Cybersecurity is not an IT department problem. It is economic infrastructure. The same way a country would not build a road network without traffic law enforcement, or a financial system without a central bank and prudential regulation, a digital economy cannot function sustainably without a cybersecurity governance layer that is built in from the start, not added on when something goes wrong. The countries and organizations that are getting this right share a common characteristic. They treat cyber resilience as a leadership issue, not a technical one. Cybersecurity decisions are made at the level of cabinet and board, not delegated entirely to IT teams who lack the authority and resources to enforce what needs to be enforced. The African Network of Cybersecurity Authorities, an initiative of the Smart Africa, has adopted a 5-year roadmap to guide continental development, with a vision for a secure and trustworthy digital ecosystem across Africa. The AU Digital Transformation Strategy and the AU AI Strategy both identify cybersecurity as a foundational requirement for digital sovereignty. The frameworks exist. The question is whether the political will to implement them at the speed the threat environment requires is there. Right now, in most places, it is not. So here are 5 specific evidence-grounded things that can close that gap. The practical takeaways. 1. Integrate cybersecurity into every digital transformation initiative from day one, not as a phase 2 activity. The Malawi e-passport case and the Kenya MSEA breach both point to the same root cause. Systems were deployed and scaled before the security layer matched the risk. Every national digital initiative, digital ID, e-government, fintech, should have a mandatory security baseline as a condition of launch, not an aspiration for the next budget cycle. 2. Ratify and implement the Malabo Convention. 12 years after it opened for signature, the AU's continental cybersecurity framework is still not broadly ratified. This is the single most concrete step African governments can take to create a common baseline. It will not solve everything on its own, but a continental framework that is actually in force creates the foundation for everything else. threat intelligence sharing, mutual legal assistance, harmonized standards. 3. Equip regulators to enforce, not just inspect. A cybersecurity regulator that can audit an organization but cannot impose meaningful consequences for non-compliance is a regulator with a clipboard and no authority. Enforcement powers, dedicated technical staff, and adequate resourcing are not luxuries. They are the difference between a law that changes behavior and a law that sits on a shelf. 4. Build cybersecurity into the education pipeline urgently and systematically. Universities, technical colleges, and vocational training institutions need funded cybersecurity programs that combine theory with practical experience. Governments should be creating incentives, scholarships, public sector placements, mandatory industry partnerships that accelerate the pipeline. The talent gap cannot be closed by importing expertise or outsourcing to MSSPs indefinitely. 5. Move from incident response to cyber resilience. Prevention will always be incomplete. The question is not just whether you can stop an attack, it is whether your systems can withstand one and recover without catastrophic disruption. National cyber resilience frameworks, mandatory business continuity requirements for critical digital infrastructure, and regular cross-sector exercises are the tools that determine how quickly a country gets back up when something goes wrong. Conclusion. Africa's digital transformation story is genuinely exciting. The ambition is real, the progress is real, the opportunity is real. But a digital economy built on infrastructure that is 60% more likely to be attacked than the global average, secured by a workforce with a 63% skills deficit, and governed by frameworks that are largely not enforced, that is not a digital economy that is going to deliver on its promise. Cybersecurity is not the gap nobody knows about. It is the gap everybody knows about and nobody wants to lead on. That needs to change. If this gave you something useful, share it with one person in your network who is making these decisions. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notification. I will see you in the next video, which is showing on your screen now. And thank you for watching.